Greetings, everyone. Bonjour, Dinue Magani Duke. Greetings, my relatives. Hello. Thank you for joining us today. This is the third part in a three-part webinar series. Looking at our attendees, and a lot of you have been with us through the entire series, so welcome back. For those of you who had not been able to join previous webinars, we're just going to go through a few items here. You have a panel to your right-hand side of your screen that is showing that you are in listen-only mode. We are recording today's webinar, and we will share that recording with you at a later date. We are also going to ask for those who are on the line, if you are a boarding school survivor or a descendant, just so we can get an idea of who is with us today. So you'll see a poll pop up on your screen. Are you a boarding school survivor? Are you a boarding school survivor's descendant, or neither? And it looks like most of you have already, there's still a few people voting. Thank you so much for letting us know. We want to know who's on the line with us. And it looks like we've got about 25% of you are boarding school survivors or descendants, and then 75% are neither. So thank you. And then the next, whoops, not that one. The next poll that's going to pop up is, what sector are you listening in from? And we assume this is going to be similar to the last two webinars, but just need to see, are you from tribal services or urban Indian services? Are you in social work, child welfare, counseling, or healing? Are you in education, academia, higher ed, or pre-K through 12? Or are you listening in from library, archival, and information sciences perspective, or other? If you are other, send us a chat and let us know which sector you're from and what your interest in our webinar is. So it looks like after 89% of you have voted, we've got 7% tribal or urban Indian services, 3% in the social work, child welfare, counseling area, 24% in education, 32% in library and information services, and 34% other. So pretty on par with our previous webinars. So thank you for bearing with us as we do that part of who's on the line with us today. So again, thank you. Today is a webinar that is focused on the Sherman Indian Museum, and we're going to introduce our panelists here in a moment. But first, we want to acknowledge our NABS staff. We have Dr. Samuel Torres with us again. We have Digital Archives Director Stephen Curley with us again. And out there on the interwebs, tweeting away on social media, we have our Director of Communications, Vance Blackfox. And I am Christine Dindisi McLeave. I'm the CEO for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. At the Boarding School Healing Coalition, our mission is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma that was created by the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. And as we've discussed with you in the past, that sounds like a simple statement, but it's a very large thing to unpack, involving truth and history, which is what this webinar series attempts to address in discussing the records and some of the stories that we know are some of those experiences that come out of boarding schools. And this entire webinar series is being brought to you by our sponsors, the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. So we thank our sponsors and we thank our panelists. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Samuel Torres to introduce our panelists. And I'll see you on the back end for the Q&A.
Tlasokamati Dindisi, Shimosi Witsino, Newat Natoka Samuel Torres, Mexica. Greetings, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Sam Torres, Director of Research and Programs, and we are excited to bring you our third and final event here. So that, and we are really excited to bring together this panel of great humans from the Sherman Indian Museum, and for them to be able to share about this great work. So today we are going to have them lead this session for us, but I would like to introduce them. They're going to present about the museum and their digitization efforts and a bit about the history of the school, the institution itself, and we'll follow up with an audience Q&A panel. So before I begin our session today, we want to be mindful to remind our viewers that certain topics and histories associated with the boarding school experience may have the possibility for heightening emotions. And with that being said, we want to invite our webinar attendees to visit our website at boardingschoolhealing.org, particularly /self-care-resources. I'm going to put that link in the chat here in a moment. Under the healing tab, you'll find a resources for self-care and trauma. There's a link and a PDF that provides some good grounding and breathing exercises if and should that becomes necessary. They're just really good grounding and breathing exercises to have in normal daily practice as well. But NABS is always focusing on the healing aspects of this work as well. And so we want to bring that to your attention. The third and final session of our Truth in History webinar series, Sharing and Contextualizing the Sherman Indian Museum, offers some really valuable context for the experiences and histories of Sherman Institute. This session features the work of the Sherman Indian Museum, led by curators Lorene Sisquoc, Amanda Wixon, and Charlotte Dominguez. Though Sherman Institute was the first off-reservation boarding school in California under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the museum exists today as a non-federally operated entity. In addition to sharing a brief historical analysis of Sherman Institute, the process and impact of the Sherman Indian Museum's digitization project will be explored, as well as how the museum has navigated curation protocols and ethical considerations regarding the digitization of Indian boarding school materials. I am pleased to introduce Lorene Sisquoc. She's the Culture Traditions Leader at Sherman Indian High School and the Director and Curator of the Sherman Indian Museum. Lorene has taught basket making, native plant uses, and material culture and traditions at Sherman Indian High School and throughout Southern California for many years. Lorene Sisquoc is a member of the Fort Sill Apache tribe and a descendant of the Mountain Cahuilla of Southern California. Her paternal grandmother attended Chilocco Indian School, Phoenix Indian School, and Haskell Indian School. Her Cahuilla ancestors attended Paris Indian School and Sherman Institute. Her great-grandfather and great-uncle attended Carlisle Indian School as well. Thank you, Lorene, for being with us today. Amanda Wixon is the assistant curator at both the Sherman Indian Museum in Riverside and the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles, California. She's a contributor and co-editor of the upcoming book, Sharp Minds, Strong Voices, 20th Century Activist American Indian Women of the American West. Wixon is also a PhD student in Native American history at the University of California in Riverside, and her research interests are in public history, American Indian identities, boarding school histories, and Native American art. Her dissertation focuses on the carceral aspects of Sherman and the methods of assimilation implemented to civilize Native youth. Thank you, Amanda, for joining us again. Charlotte Dominguez earned her BA in Public and Oral History from CSU San Bernardino in 2009 and her MS in Library and Information Science from San Jose State in 2015. She started her career in archives as an intern at the Pechanga Cultural Resources Facility, where she worked for 8 years as a curation technician and exhibit designer. While at Pechanga, she learned to process and catalog artifacts, documents, and photographs, and she designed and installed several dozen exhibits in tribal buildings and at local museums. Her work on the virtual museum and the Pechanga Tribal Government Center introduced her to the possibilities of using digitization to preserve artifacts and documents while also making them more accessible to others. Between 2017 and 2019, she was the project coordinator for the Sherman Indian Museum Digitization Project. She currently works as the librarian for Sherman Indian High School. Thank you, all three panelists, for joining us today. We are very glad that you are joining us. And with that, I will turn it over to Amanda and the team here. Thank you again. So I'm gonna change the presenter permissions, and Amanda, the floor is yours. And we'll need you to unmute yourself.
Can
There we
everybody
go.
see my screen now?
Yes, it's
Okay.
clear and we can hear you. Very nice. Thank you.
Okay. So we'll begin. So this will be in 3 parts, and I'll be presenting a little bit first about Sherman Indian boarding school history, Sherman Institute history, just so everybody's kind of on the same page, if you're not already. Okay, so this is where we are, tribal intersections. So I always like to put a map up to show kind of where Sherman is located, but you must keep in mind always that these borders are arbitrary, and most of this land, all of this land is somewhat shared territory. So on the left we have the little riverside map, and that's where Sherman is located in Southern California, and then we have a more specific tribal map on the right. Okay, so the Indian problem. There was an Indian problem in California, much like everywhere else in the US. In California, settlers had precious Indian groups inland, and gold rush greed and racism led to the genocide of the Indians in California. Following California's statehood in 1850, settlers regarded the surviving Indians as a poverty-stricken nuisance. Many natives fell victim to a form of indentured servitude similar to slavery. Battles over land and resources continued, leading to the removal and sequestering of indigenous groups onto reservations. Most of these groups faced starvation and disease that resulted in further population declines. This image depicts native families at Big Spring Rancheria near Mount Rumadu, which is there in Riverside. Helen Hunt Jackson, who you probably have heard of, a popular author, described the mission Indians, so-called mission Indians of this time, as living like gypsies in huts, eking out a miserable existence by daily work. Images like this piqued the interest of many members of white society who now wanted to help the Indians in this new stage of progressivism. So here we are at Sherman. I'm not going to go so much into the Paris history. We've talked about it, I think, in other webinars, but Sherman Institute is, even though it kind of stemmed from Paris Indian School, they operated simultaneously at one time until they closed Paris and sent everybody over to Sherman. The first grounds, the cornerstone was laid in 1901, but they didn't start accepting students till about 1902, and then they started classes in 1903. So in 1901, the federal government established the last of the 25 off-reservation boarding school in Riverside. In 1902, 18 Pima students were enrolled and a handful of mission Indians. Enrollment increased from year to year, and by 1908, there was a capacity of 550 students. Evoking the mission era, the architecture of the school site encouraged a romanticized version of California history, one that did not reference the loss of native peoples under the Spanish fathers. Early California enthusiast and founder of the Southwest Museum, Charles Lopez, which I work heavily in that collection at the Autry. He promoted the school as a tourist attraction in Riverside. In 1905, he wrote this about the Sherman Institute. It may be that the Indian whose forefathers built the missions is of peculiar interest to you, as here he is caught young and tamed and educated. There is no other place in California where you can see so many Indian children at so slight a cost of time and trouble. And he was close friends with Frank Miller, who was also an early promoter of Riverside, and who in fact owned the streetcar and the land next to Sherman, where there was a zoo, other kinds of attractions would happen. So it was really kind of the brainchild of both of them to create this major kind of, Indian Disneyland, where you could take the train from LA, directly land right in front of Sherman, and then for a couple of pennies, you could hire a little Sherman student to take you around the school. And of course, there were no fences, and most places were not off limits for tourists. In fact, in 1902, we have a letter from Harwood Hall, the superintendent, asking the BIA to give them a fence because people were coming in at all times, every time, just in and out of the school. So let's see, what's going on. All right, so Sherman, this is the graduating class of 1908, and that was when they had that capacity of 500 students. Sherman administration filled the students' daily lives with work and activities. The curriculum included a basic level of academic learning, arithmetic, history, geography, spelling, and writing. However, the vocation programs consumed most of the students' time. Female students were limited to domestic sciences, sewing, laundry, housekeeping, and childcare, and later a little bit of nursing. Male students did agricultural work, painting, printing, blacksmithing, painting, carpentry, and shoemaking. The students also worked to keep the school operating, cooking, gardening, tending to the animals, and all other forms of manual labor. As an extracurricular activity, students were encouraged to join school-approved clubs and societies like the Mandolin Club and Literary Society, as modeled after Carlisle. And sports, of course, were also a huge part of the school program, with football, track, baseball, and basketball teams regularly competing against other schools, including schools like USC. And they're a big financial draw for the school as well. We have in our records many letters from the superintendent kind of inviting anyone to come because it was a big revenue inducing for them. Okay, so this one, actually, I wanted to switch. It's a little bit out of order. I'm going to show you a video right now. It's from 1915, and it's from the Library of Congress. And it was meant to be a promotional video because, of course, like a lot of federal institutes, and especially Sherman, it was a constant search for money and support at the state, local, state government, and federal level. So they produce these kinds of films to get people interested in programs like the Sherman Institute. So let's see if we can show that. This was part of a UC Riverside project called States of Incarceration that identified Sherman Institute as a site of consciousness and remembrance. And this film was made at UC Riverside by overlaying the salt songs. So we have the full, there's actually a little bit more to it. It's about twice as long as that. And it shows some of the Hopi runners and some other sports, I believe, but that's the gist of it anyways. And we do have that on file at Sherman. Actually, it came to us by the infamous Huell Hauser of the California Gold series, who interviewed Sisquoc about Sherman Indian Museum. Sorry about that. Hello. Sorry about that. Can everybody still hear me? Yes? Yes. Okay. So, and Huell Hauser came a couple years back and interviewed Lorene Sisquoc about the museum and about the school, and he procured that video for us. So we have that, and we have copies of that as well. All right, so let's go back to this, attacking Native identity. So one way to understand how identities changed in Indian boarding schools is to use some models, right? So this is a very well-known book, Real Indians by Eva Garoot, and she kind of categorizes these ways to attack Native identities biologically, legally, self-identification, and culturally. And we can see this precisely from our records. These are real records from Sherman. So biologically, they're attacked by, of course, gender. So of course, you can either be male or female, no two spirits here. Legally, you know, they were defining who could be a Native American, who wasn't. You had to be a quarter to come in. Although we know from our records, this was largely arbitrary and self-reported. We have records of somebody who was a full-blooded Indian and then came back to be a quarter, and then maybe a third another time. It was largely dependent on who was taking your records at the time. For self-identification, If they didn't self-identify, then most often than not in this period, they were just labeled as missions, or in one case or several cases you can see as digger Indians, which is a derogatory term and probably should have been labeled Miwok. And also culturally, by assigning certain students these kind of arbitrary labels, you're kind of instilling kind of the dominant population's idea of what you should be. We're missing a label in here that was actually Catholic or Protestant, and there was no choice. You were either Catholic or you're Protestant. Of course, because despite what the rules were, Catholics and Protestants made their way very quickly onto the campus and would attract students by offering food, which they kind of still do sometimes. There's 2 churches across the street from Sherman, and that was part of the outing project for some students would go to the church and help clean them. They also hosted weekends out into Riverside, accompanied by church members, dances. They hosted a mother-son dance, which was kind of popular, but then they also hosted a father-daughter dance, which was not so popular and ended rather unceremoniously shortly after it started. So we can see by these kinds of records that there's models can be drawn from them. So this cultural, let me see, I'm going back here. Okay, darker the better. This quote is directly from a 1902 letter from the superintendent Harwood Hall to an Indian agent in the field. In the letter, and many others like it, Harwood Hall encourages agents to recruit dark Indians for the school. It was important to the administration that students show Indian in addition to the 1/4 blood requirement. The school's stated purpose to assimilate uncivilized Indian children did not include white Indians. Visitors to Sherman expected to see real Indians, not light-skinned individuals who looked more like themselves. And remember, like some other schools that might have been kind of far out of the way, Sherman was right there in the center of town. And so, you know, performance and spectacle was a big element to Sherman. Within this racialized space, the ideal Indian could be realized: clean, Christian, docile, and useful. Students learned that Indians that were not real ideal Indians were exactly the opposite: dirty, ignorant, rowdy, and lazy. Those in charge feared that students would go, of course, we've heard this term, back to the blanket, and so they devalued their cultures and that they came from and encouraged them to disassociate with their old lives. So here's a picture of some of the child care training that was going on at Sherman, and you can see that they're taking care of white children, and most likely it's the children of the staff and faculty. So we have lots of those. Just move on. Okay, so the Native student responses to this, and this is something I always like to talk about because we kind of dwell a lot, especially in boarding school records, you're getting all this very data-driven information, but this is actually the real life responses to it. So acceptance, rejection, resistance, temporary acceptance, and teaching and employment. So while some Sherman students embraced assimilation, others did not. Students often use the surrounding citrus groves to speak their languages, sing songs, and tell stories away from Sherman administration and the local community. A number of students escaped into the groves, running away from the school and authorities to pursue different paths. As individuals and as a community, the students chose which elements of assimilation to embrace, which to tolerate, and which to ignore. So the top right is a fairly recent book about Viola Martinez and Owens Valley Paiute. While at Sherman, she would climb the palm trees with her sister to speak Paiute, but eventually lost her language. She later overcame racial stereotypes to pursue a college degree and spent several years working at a Japanese American internment camp during World War II. Later, she became a teacher and a founding member of the Los Angeles American Indian Education Commission. And this is one of our honored, in the middle there is our honored elder, Galen Townsend, a Shoshone Paiute whose parents graduated in the early 1930s and then found employment at Sherman. Mr. Townsend and his brothers and sister grew up on the campus, and later he came back to teach art. His son is now a coach at the school, and his daughter is a teacher at Sherman. So he's still, up until recently, obviously with COVID, he was coming in pretty regularly and holding his hours there and kept the museum open because, as you know, we're volunteer run, and he was there to provide all kinds of stories and entertainment to anybody that came in. And then, of course, we have Last but not least, we have Lorene Sisquoc, the director of the museum. You met her already, or you saw her on this Zoom. And she is a third-generation Sherman teacher who also grew up on the campus and is currently the director of Sherman Indian Museum and the cultural traditions leader. Sorry, that's my parrots. She works tirelessly to promote cultural awareness in the community and to encourage students to embrace their own cultural practices. So changing attitudes. Over the last century, attitudes towards Indians and Indian boarding school history has changed. With a new BIA commissioner, the program at Sherman shifted more towards an emphasis on Native arts. Sherman students were encouraged to produce commercially viable artworks to support themselves and their communities after they graduated. Policy shifts also came as a result of the Merriam Report in 1928 and the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934. The Indian New Deal, as it was called, aimed to abandon the goal of assimilation and to encourage tribes to access their historic traditions and cultures, at least on paper. Programs like the Navajo Special Program in the 40s actually discouraged traditional Navajo notions of labor and gender roles. On an international level, World War I and World War II changed perceptions of Native people and their levels of patriotism. And patriotism was a big part of the early program at Sherman too. Like Carlisle, it was somewhat militaristic and, you know, with official parades on Sundays and flag raising and lowering, etc. Thousands of Native soldiers fought bravely and earned the respect of many members of the non-Native population. During the Cold War, groups like the National Indian Youth Council, some of whom actually went to Sherman, they encouraged awareness and activism in and out of the Native community, and activist movements brought Native American issues to the forefront with the occupation of Alcatraz and other dramatic protests. During the 80s and 90s, with increased emphasis on tribal sovereignty and resource development, many tribes moved into financially lucrative enterprises. Their impact is now felt at Sherman, where financial donations are made to promote cultural programs. Academic interest in the boarding school experience has also contributed to general awareness of Sherman and other aspects of Native communities. But also this increased academic awareness has further destabilized our materials at the museum. So that was something that kind of led us into the programs that Charlotte was going to talk about a little bit later. So programs, responding to these national and institutional changes, as well as the needs of their own communities, Sherman students today participate in more Native-centered program, in addition to regular high school curriculum. I like to talk about the programs and clubs just because, you know, we are all working in Sherman records and boarding school records, and a lot of these places are closed, gone. We're not even sure where they are. We don't know where the records are for sure, but Sherman is special. You know, it's one of the last 4 federal schools that's still open, and this is what they're doing now to preserve their culture. You know, it looks a lot different than it did 100 years ago, and it's sometimes we become a little bit separated from that when we're looking in records, but we have to. I like to remind people that this is still going on today. You know, and it's the face of it has changed a lot. Let's see. So I like to show this picture too. It's a 2017 graduation picture. And it looks a lot different, obviously, from our 1908 graduation picture. The one on the top is the intertribal ceremony, and that takes place the day before the regular graduate ceremony. Oh, I'm sorry, opposite. The intertribal ceremony is on the bottom, and then the regular formal graduation is on the top. I think that they go together very well because they're a good visual example of how things have changed. Sherman Indians here are participating in this kind of ages-old ceremony with medieval robes and references to medieval Europe. But while in the picture, the other picture asserts their tribal identity with the regalia and the banners and shows that their identities have expanded. They're not this or that. They're not the bottom or the top. They're both. And so then I like to do this too at the end. A lot of our records with Sherman, you know, it's a small community, but most of our people that are accessing these records are alumni, people that actually went here, or their parents went here, or their grandparents went here, or their kids still go here. So a lot of our work tends to be, especially in digitization, can be potentially very sensitive because we're going back family lineages of people that are still living there, still active in the community, and has real repercussions. What we uncover or choose to share has real repercussions for families in Southern California and everywhere else in Navajo land, etc. So generations of Sherman students forged new identities in the face of extreme pressure by incorporating new cultural practices meant to assimilate Native people. However, by reasserting their own cultural beliefs, histories, and practices, they're expanding their identities as Native people and slowly decolonizing the boarding schools, once a powerful symbol of Euro-American cultural hegemony. Today, Sherman Indians are resourceful, innovative, and committed to their communities in ways that will ensure the survival of their cultures for generations to come. And I think that's very important for us. As Charlotte will speak about this later, one of the key ingredients of the grant that we worked on with the University of California, Riverside, was that students be involved. And it's the students that are doing the manual labor to preserve their own histories. And so as we go forward as a museum, I'm hoping, that there's even, with resources, there's more involvement in our museum studies so they can continue and a wider group of students can continue to kind of contribute to this cultural legacy. So that's it for me. And I am going to pass it over to Sisquoc. Are you ready, Sisquoc?
Yes. Do you have my slides?
Yes, they're on.
First of all, I want to thank the NABS staff for their hard work and for inviting us and including us in this. I attended the conference last year with Amanda, and it was wonderful, and the work they're doing is wonderful. Also, I'd like to thank Manuel for their sponsoring this program, and also acknowledge our ancestors of the land here, the Cahuilla, Serrano, Tongva, and Luiseño people. And all our ancestors that have attended these schools. So Amanda covered pretty good about our museum. We were established in 1970. We are housed in the original administration building of the school. This building was slated to be demolished along with the other buildings, the older buildings on campus. And it was requested by alumni, by facility staff and employees of the school to not just to demolish the museum here and to preserve it and turn it into a museum. It was finally approved under one stipulation that it would be at no expense to the government. So the museum has never been in the school's budget or any budget. So we, as Amanda mentioned, and they mentioned, we are not a nonprofit organization either. We're just a wonderful museum that has made it through 40 years somehow through volunteers and donations, and we're trying to bring it now up to the standards today. And so that's why I really feel blessed to have Amanda and Charlotte on the team to help with this, and much of it's volunteer now. And I'm very happy to have Charlotte on staff here at Sherman now, and so the library and the museum can work on great projects to keep things going here. So there's good hope. But a little bit about our archives. We have our letterpress books. We have from letterpress books start at about 1892 with the first talking about Paris Indian School, the building of the school there, and our letterpress books go up into the early 1900s. Those are the administration's letters that were sent usually to the Department of Education or the Office of Indian Education. All kinds of requests, all kinds of really boring things, and then the next page is like something amazing, or anyway, as researchers know how that goes. So our letterpress books, we have those. We have the registration ledgers from 1892 and up, which that starts at Paris also. Correspondence, photographs, negatives. We have pamphlets, and then one of the really important things for our researchers is our school bulletins, the newsletters. You can find everything from who married who came back to visit, what activities the students were in. We talk a lot about former students, employees. Some people come back and say, I didn't know Grandpa was married to so-and-so before Grandma. Or, there's a lot of information in these news bulletins. They started in 1907. So they have been a good source for our researchers. The researchers, I've been working here at the museum since I started volunteering here in 1985. And we've had academic researchers, everything from homeschool students to kindergarten students to PhD dissertations. We've had people come for filmmaking, for publications, for exhibitions. We get all kinds of requests for of research. We have international researchers. We have some publications here that are in the Japanese language about our baseball teams in the early 1900s. So we're a great source to many people, and so preservation of these archives is very, very important to us. And the first attempt at it was in about the mid-1990s, when we accepted the opportunity to have these all of these documents I talked about, including yearbooks. I didn't mention yearbooks also. They were put on microfilm. And so that was pretty beneficial. A set of them were up in the State Library and then at the Fresno Library, because it was a California grant that was we were included in. And that was very beneficial for the times, and did help with keeping control of our documents and preservation of them. But time moved on, we needed to get to the digitizing part. And so it was a lot of years of wishing and wanting to do that. And so eventually we were able to be part of this digitization project that Charlotte will talk to you about. What I'm going to share with you today is just a little about my search of the boarding school history and how important I think it is to have all of our archives at all facilities digitized and accessible. I've been able to find some of my ancestors through Carlisle, through Sherman, a little bit at Haskell, but the other places I've wanted to search I haven't been able to find. So I understand the people that come in here, like the last minute coming in and saying, my grandma came to school here, or my grandpa or something. I don't know what tribe they are. I don't know what year. Can you help us? We get all kinds of mysterious questions. Well, one year I was one of those people. I took my daughter to attend Haskell Indian School, and about 2005. And I knew my grandma went there, but I didn't know what year. I wasn't sure. And I had an hour to find out. And I was one of those people that came in. So that's why we're very understanding with people trying to find their research. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I found. But this is just to do with how important preserving and making available these documents are. Also, you have to keep in mind, we need to get those interviews from our elders, from those existing that are still here, or even their children that may have memories of what grandma and grandpa talked about being in the boarding schools, because those are the true stories of their experiences. These are documents. We all know what documents, who writes them, whose side it's on. We know they are relevant, but they also are sometimes there is also a different story behind them. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm kind of starting from the earliest boarding school experiences in our family. My grandmother's father, Talbot Gude, he attended Carlisle from 1887 to 1890. These are some early pictures of him, and his the one on the left is him in his uniform, the Indian school uniform. Next slide. And those two pictures that I showed before, one of the archivists at Barbara Landis, who did a lot of tremendous work there, she gifted me or blessed us with a picture of her grandfather. So I was able to obtain that from her years ago. when we had our boarding school blues conference here. These documents just found online at the Carlisle website. So I just wanted to share those just briefly of some of the documents you can find on your ancestors, and they just tell the stories of what they did. This is that he got sent home sick, I believe, and the other is about his outing, so that he was part of the outing program. This is Talbot Gude, my grandmother's father. Next slide. And next slide. That's just another of the outing systems showing where they went. As well, our records, we do have these type, not this particular form, but we have records of where our students in the early days worked, the people that requested them. This is an example of the Carlisle newsletter. Ours is called the Sherman Bulletin. This is the Indian Helper. I think they had several newsletters, but I just wanted to show this one. This is, and I can't see the year, 1880 something. Can you see it? Can anybody see it? Anyway, on the second page on the top, it has that a letter from Talbot Gude was received, and so he had already left the school. So this is probably 1890. He had already left the school and went back to our tribe who was still imprisoned at the Alabama barracks. And it's just a letter from him. They kind of repeat the letter, and he's saying how things are back home and what's going on. So looking through these archives is so important because you can find just little bits and pieces like that. You can piece your family together, where they were, what they experienced in this. So this is what I put this one. Go ahead to the next one. So that was Talbot Gude also. And this just is a little bit of his background. But at the end, it does talk about, you know, where he went to Carlisle from 1887 till 1890, and then returned back to his our tribe that was at the Mount Vernon Barracks at the time. But at the end, it talks about he was a noted singer and revived our mountain spirit ceremony for the tribe. And I just wanted to bring that up because a lot of our ancestors did that. They assimilated, they went through the process, they learned the trade, they learned what they had to do, but they went back and did something like this for their tribes. And he was a singer. He lived to be until 1962. I believe he was 90-some years old. And I never did get to meet him, but I've heard many stories about him. And I just like to acknowledge that, you know, that they did go through that process, and they were still able to come back, many of them, not all, and to carry these things on. We still have in our tribal collection buckskin dress that he made, other beadwork, things like that. Next slide. Then we had another, on our Kauai side, one of our great uncles, it would be my great-grandfather's brother, Manuel Largo, attended Carlisle Indian School. And I just wanted to bring that up. This was also, I was excited to find this in the Carlisle archives that are online. And so I was able to take a screenshot of them. And I'm sure would be able to get copies of the originals too. Next slide. So this is just a list of some of the things that I found of our family that attended the boarding schools. Here at Paris Indian School and Sherman, our Largo family, which is my Kauai ancestors, my mother's grandfathers and his brothers attended Sherman and Paris Indian School. Next slide. One of the things that I was pretty excited to find years ago when I first was working here at the museum was information about a great uncle, Thomas Largo. His brother Anthony is my grandfather, my mother's father's father. And they were born at the village of Palpisa here on Kauai territory, Mountain Kauai territory. And they attended Paris Indian School and then Sherman also. Some of them came to Sherman, and then some went on to Phoenix Indian School after that. But Thomas, I kept hearing his name when I first started volunteering here. different visitors coming through and things, and would ask, what is our Cahuilla blood? And I'd say the Largo family, and they'd always mention Tom Largo, and I never, had met him or didn't know of him. And then one day I found his bio here in our archives, and I was excited about that. And he talked about his time here at Sherman. I think it's in the next slide. I'll read to you about that. But also, one day we received the California Indian Wax Cylinder Project book, and of course I go to look at any Cahuilla songs, and I find that in 1904, Tom Largo, Faustino Lugo, and Ignacio Costo recorded our bird songs here at Sherman from the ethnographer Charles Loomis. Came and recorded several Native students here on the campus with wax cylinder recordings and recorded their tribal songs. Well, I was able to obtain a copy of that, and then found that it was in our newsletter. So there's just a lot of really, through investigating and sometimes, like I said, I kept hearing about him, kept finding things on him, and kind of ended when I finally got the recordings. And they're the same bird songs, of course, that we sing today. And it just connected also to in our family, just to know that, because we didn't have any knowledge of any of our family members who still sang or did sing the songs and things like that. And so to know that he did, and that they were passed on and preserved that way too. So we were able to obtain a copy of that. And then as a note, in 1998, San Manuel, the tribe sponsored the recordings of Mr. Robert Levi, a Sherman alumni and former student and former employee of Sherman. He recorded his bird song CDs here in 1998. So to see these types of things being preserved here at these schools that were designed to take that away, that's what it's all about for me. I'm really glad to have been part of it and know about it. Next slide. This is just a little bit from Tom Largo's bio, and he talks about Paris Indian School. After the day school on the reservation, I attended the government boarding school that was then in existence, and now there was no walking to and from school. In the beginning of it, he talks about his home life at Cahuilla and the day school he attended, but I just took this part out about Paris. They were very strict at Paris Indian School and did not want us to talk our Indian tongue. And if we did and were caught at it, we were punished. At Paris, we only went to school for half a day. The other half a day was spent doing some kind of work. My first job was herding the pigs at the school. And if we didn't watch those pigs as the instructor thought we should, they would give us a whipping when the pigs would scatter in all directions. One particular occasion when we didn't watch the pigs as the instructor thought we should, it was because we were going to be on the Thanksgiving program and had to learn some verses to say. And on that particular occasion, I suppose I was more interested in learning the verses than I was in watching the pigs. After the pigs job, I was put to work as an office messenger. I think I must have liked that better. At Paris School, there were children from many of the other Indian reservations in Southern California. So we got acquainted with other Indian children and liked to hear them tell about their things at home. However, on account of the shortage of water, the school had to be closed. Before our school closed, they started one at Riverside. There had to be an act of Congress passed, which was done as soon as possible so that we would have a school to go to. The Riverside Indian School, or Sherman Indian School, the Sherman Institute, was named after the Senator of New York, who did much towards the passage of the bill for the school at Riverside. The cornerstone of this school was laid July 1901 in honor of Senator James Schoolcraft Sherman. So that's a little bit from his bio. And when he mentions that about how the different students from the local tribes, were able to meet, that is one thing about boarding schools is all the tribal friendships and the networks that we have formed in all these years. So go ahead and go to the next one, including the intertribal marriages. Then the next is my grandmother, Ida Gude, and her married name is Largo. These are some early pictures of her. But this is a little note. She left a lot of good records for us. And this one is just all the schools she attended. And as you can see, in 1913, she started first grade. She was 10 years old when she started first grade. She was born in 1903. And she attended Chilocco and Chilocco and Chilocco. And then she went back home to Fletcher, Fletcher, Oklahoma for 1 year during the 4th grade. And then from 5th grade through 10th grade, she attended Phoenix Indian School, and which she graduated with a certificate, 10th grade. She was 20 years old. She still wanted her high school diploma, so she stayed on at the school and took the city bus to Phoenix Union for the next 2 years for her 11th and 12th grade. And when she was 22 years old, she graduated with her high school diploma. From there, she went on to Carlisle Indian School and then started working for 1 year at Phoenix Indian School, and then became an employee also at Phoenix Indian School. Go ahead and go to the next. And this is just her certificate of study at Haskell Indian School. Go ahead and go to the next. She did the 2-year normal program for teachers. It's called the normal program. And this is what I found on my 1-hour visit to the archives at Haskell. Found her in the yearbook. She is on the top row. She's the 3rd from the left. And it just talks about her, that she, her personality, it talks about her. Go ahead and go to the next. And we were so excited to find that. So I just know how important archives are. This is a graduating class of her and her sister. When I mentioned she graduated from Phoenix Indian School in the 10th grade, her and her sister, Bessie, this is a picture of them, the 1919 graduating class at Phoenix Indian School. Go ahead. And this is just her class. These are her grandmother's at the end, standing with her class when she became a teacher in the Indian day schools. And go ahead and go to the next one. She taught at Tuba City there. Also, our grandfather, Joseph Largo, attended, and his siblings attended Phoenix Indian School. And so those are records that I'd like to find too. Go ahead and go to the next one. Or is that the last one? This is just, so she went on to teach at the day schools. Go ahead and go to the next one. And she went on to teach at the day schools for about 10 to 15 years at Shanto and at Tuba City. And then eventually, go ahead and go to the next one. Eventually, it came to Sherman in 1951 to teach here during the Navajo program and raise her children here, because she did not want them to attend boarding school. So that kind of ended our attending boarding school life, and we lived on the campus. I was born here on the campus, or born at the hospital adjacent to the school, but we lived on campus. My grandmother retired here from Sherman in 1967. She gave 40 years of service in the Indian School Service. My mother worked here from 1969 to 2000 when she retired, and I started here in 1982, and I'm still here. So we became part of the, we're VIA brats, which followed the boarding schools or the Indian schools, and then now we're employees here at the school. So I just wanted to share my experience about that and the importance of our archives in our personal lives, and then also for academic and other purposes. So I'd like to hand it over to Charlotte and thank them both.
Hello, everybody. So I'm going to be talking specifically about the Sherman Indian Museum digitization project and my part in that. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So I didn't come onto the project until after the grant had been written. So let me talk a little bit about what I know about what happened before I got on the project in July 2017. It was a collaboration between Sherman Indian Museum and the UCR Library In that picture there is, of course, Lori, ever present, and Eric Malinkowitz, who at the time was the digitization, what was his title? Oh, darn, I'm sorry, I forgot. And he was in charge of the digitization department for the library. I apologize, I can't remember his title. And he was my direct supervisor. The grant was written with assistance from Dr. Cliff Trasfer, who's the Costa Professor of American Indian Affairs History. The library staff and the museum staff worked together to inventory the collection and complete the grant documents. I was told it took approximately 8 hours to do the initial survey for the grant estimates because it's a pretty large collection. And then it took about 3 to 4 months to label all the boxes and folders and create the rough draft of the finding aid. Both of those activities, the initial survey and the boxes and folders creation, those were done at the expense of the UCR library as part of their cost sharing efforts. So it was a true collaboration. After the grant was written, the museum received a Digitizing Hidden Collections grant from the Council on Library and Information Resources. The total grant funding was $376,000 and some change. And UCR actually administered the grant, and then that was Eric's job, was to monitor the spending and, you know, make sure I was doing what I was supposed to do. And then he also largely dealt with the vendors because some items were sent out. Next slide, please. So of course, ultimately our main goal was to digitize the archival collection. The reason why we wanted to do this because there were so many requests for information and research appointments. You know, Lori and Amanda were volunteers. They just didn't have the time to honor every single request. So we wanted to make it easier for them to answer the request. Also, digitizing the documents protects them from a lot of excessive handling. Some of the documents and images are really fragile. Anybody who worked with, you know, 100-year-old books knows that they start to fall apart after a while. A majority of the collection was published on calisphere.org. If you go there, you can just do a search for Sherman Indian Museum, and it'll pop right up. We wanted to publish it on calisphere.org because it's hosted through the UC system, so there's no cost to the museum. It increases the accessibility for state alumni, and we also wanted to raise the awareness. You know, working here for the couple of years that I did, when I would talk about what I was doing, people would ask me, well, where is it? What is it? And it made me so sad because there's so many important things here, and people just, they were clueless. So having the collection online, it's going to, you know, open doors for a lot of people, especially students. One thing I wanted to point out is that there are some restricted items. Not everything was published, mainly due to the sensitivity of the contents, and Lori and Amanda had final say on that. Another goal of the project was we wanted to make sure that the students were involved, and they were paid. We couldn't hire everybody, unfortunately, who applied, but what we wanted to do to make sure that everybody at least got some part of the experience is we did an actual application. They had to fill out an application, submit it by a deadline. Everybody who applied was interviewed. And then Lori and I sat down and decided based on the students' answers who would be hired and who wouldn't. And over 2 years, we were able to hire 12 Sherman students. They worked after school, 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, under the condition that school came first. So if they needed time off to catch up for homework or take a test or whatever, that always came first, no penalties. And And that was a really good experience. You can see in the picture there, there's 2 of my very first Sherman students. I still have relationships with both of them, so they text me once in a while, let me know how they're doing. But it was a really good experience for me. I hope it was a good experience for them. At the end of each student who was hired, I had between 2 and 4 students every semester, and their terms of service were about a semester long. There was one semester ran a little long, so I actually had 4 students that semester, 2 at a time. And at the end of their service, they all got letters of recommendation for their future job or college applications. Next slide, please. So as Lori mentioned, the collection content goes all the way back to 1892. We're starting with the school rosters and the letterpress books from the school superintendent, dating and up to 1995 was the documents. We also had Sherman Bulletins, flyers from school plays. We had newsletters from other schools that students would send in. I can't think, I must be missing something. We also had photographs dating back from 1900 up to the present. However, we only published photographs that went up to the year 2000. And, oh, there's the Sherman Bulletins, 1907 to 1984. And then school yearbooks from 1915 to 2009. One of the amazing things about this collection is that we have an almost complete collection, almost complete run of yearbooks and school newsletters. There were a couple of years that we were missing for the yearbooks, but those were actually years that they didn't print a yearbook. I think the only one we're missing that was printed that we didn't have, I think, was 1984. So pretty impressive. Next slide, please. The digitization process, one of the first things that I did when I came on the job was to refine the finding aid. It had already been created, a draft had already been created, but there were holes. So I had to go through the collection, find out what was missing, you know, just update missing dates or incorrect dates. One of the nice things about going through the museum was it's like a treasure box. I don't know if anybody's ever gotten to work in a small museum like this, but every cupboard has something amazing in it. So I kept finding things, so I had to keep updating the finding aid. It took me probably the better part of 6 months to find everything that needed to be on there. So, but we got it done, and that was pretty great. We also organized and packed all the documents that were going to the outside vendor. We worked with a company called Luna because they had experience doing digitizing historical documents. A large part of the grant budget went for that, but it was decided that that was the most cost-efficient choice because as far as space went, there really wasn't space in the museum, isn't space in the museum for like a proper book scanner. And a lot of the bound documents were pretty fragile because of their age. And it would have added a lot of time to the project. So I think we was somewhere around the $90,000. I can't remember the exact number, but somewhere around that amount to actually send out the bulk of the documents. And I think it ended up being a little over 3,000 documents that they scanned for us. But I had to organize and pack them all before they went to the vendor, create packing lists and all of that to make sure that everything that went out came back. I also, part of my job was to hire, like I mentioned before, and train the student interns on the archival best practices and the digitization process. We kept what the high school students did, you know, pretty limited. I mean, we knew they weren't going to have a massive skill set because they were still in high school, but they picked up the digitization process really quickly. They learned how to carefully remove photographs from the sheets and papers that they were glued to. They learned how to operate the scanner. They learned how to use the editing program. We just used Adobe Photoshop. It was pretty straightforward. And of course, uploading the documents to the storage devices that we had on file. We did, for the high school students, they did a little bit of the metadata, but spelling was an issue. And so when they did the metadata, I did it with them. So it was just, one-on-one kind of thing for the metadata, just so that they would become familiar with description techniques. They didn't do that on their own. I actually did the bulk of the metadata with a little bit of help from some UCR students. And then when we were actually uploading it to Calisphere later on in the project, the UCR staff did that. We had issues with on-site storage space and internet speed. So we did try to do the Nextio uploads, but it was literally taking like 8 hours to do 100 images. So they went ahead and took over that. Yeah, it took a long time. They went ahead and took over that task. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide. Oh, there you go. So this is just a screenshot of the first page of the collection on Calisphere, just so you have an idea of what you would find if you went to the website. And you can see, I can't see the number, but it looks like it says 13,728 items. If you look, a couple of the pictures on the right-hand side, you can see there's a blue bar. Those are items that we chose to restrict the images for various reasons. We wanted to restrict the images, but we wanted people to know that they existed in the collection, and then they could access the metadata that we attached to it for searching purposes. And then the message in that box just tells them if they want to access that information or that image, they can contact the museum. Next slide, please. So here's just a breakdown by the numbers. So 2 years on the project. Here's a couple of my other interns. They're scanning some slides that we found, one of the little treasures that I ran across when we were going through what was available in the museum. And so that was actually one of the things we did at the very end, is we scanned, gosh, I don't remember, it must have been about 1,000 of those slides. And you see the scanner that we had. Luckily, it could scan multiple images at once, so that saved us a lot of time. Project funding, as I mentioned before, $376,000. We scanned over 10,000 images and over 3,000 documents. And then where it says object scanned, we had a collection of ribbons and the high school letters that we had to identify as objects, but they fit in a scanner, so we scanned them. And you'll find those on Calisphere. And then, so total number of student workers hired and trained, 12 Sherman students and 4 UCR students. And the reason why we had a couple of UCR students is because we were falling behind on the scanning, and the Sherman students couldn't work during the day, and UCR students could. And we had money in the budget for it, so we had them come on for a few hours in the mornings while the Sherman students weren't here. Because of the background check issue, their hours never overlapped. And then, as I mentioned before, the total items that are available on Calisphere is 13,728. Next slide, please. So future goals, we're hoping as more and more people access the collection on Calisphere, that they are willing and able to contact the museum to let us know who some of these people are. So many of the photos have nothing on them, no identification, or sometimes if we're lucky, they might have a date, a year written on the back, or like I think this photo of the cheerleaders that you see there, I think it just says cheerleading team. I think that's all it says. So we had to just go with what we could identify in the photos. Also, we're expecting improved research response time, both for people who are researching on their own and for the museum staff. We're looking to create teaching kits, maybe putting together some reproduction items that local schools can use when they're teaching about Native American history in the area. And of course, there's still more to digitize. We'd like to eventually do that too. Next slide. I think that's actually the last one. Yep. Oh. I guess we're open for questions.
Yes, thank you so much. Very substantive conversation, and we're really grateful to all three of you for offering us your time and your knowledge. We do have some time for questions and answers, and while there are a few, we are hoping to get a bit more. So if you have any questions for the team that's present here, we'd love to entertain those questions and share them with our team here. But before we get into that, I have a question myself that I'd like to ask the three of you, and open to either of you, whichever this makes more sense to. But of the 367 schools that NABS has identified, we recognize and have identified 74 that have remained open today. And you mentioned one of 4 federally funded, federally operated schools that are open today. How many of, or what have your experiences been regarding the process of indigenization at Sherman? I know you mentioned it a little bit, Amanda and Lorene, about the cultural traditions. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on some of the really profound, impactful practices, classes, aspects of culture and social life on campus that have really been addressed as a result of that. And maybe if you could address also how Sherman has addressed the complex history of being an assimilative boarding model from the beginning, and how that's played out and how it's different now. I know a lot to think about, a couple of parts to that question.
I think that's for Lorene.
Yeah, but I'm just, no, I don't have any comments on that right now.
I can probably say a few things. I mean, largely it's been, the reason is the change in faculty. It started with 99% non-native people, and now we have many more, much more, because a lot of these students grew up, graduated, and then came back to Sherman. And sometimes even, I mean, in the earlier years, for sure, there wasn't a lot of opportunities open to them. I mean, the schools train them to do outdated trades. So you're going to graduate and become a harness maker, but there's no harness maker jobs. So a lot of them kind of found their way back into the school systems in various capacities. And then as, of course, national events, marched on, and Native Americans had access to more higher education, they were able to come back to those schools where they felt comfortable. And so it's really, the change has been driven by the faculty. And so people like Sisquoc is definitely at the forefront at it. I mean, some of the classes you can take now as opposed to then. You can take basketry, you can take, they have powwow nights, they have unity circles, they have talking circles, they have a unity fire that they burn when students come for a week. They do, I mean, just endless. I mean, this is a 24-hour school. Like, what I meant by the last 4, it's the last 4 federal operated boarding schools. So they are programming 24 hours a day. So all these wonderful teachers have found a way to fill the students' days with these extracurricular activities that in some ways directly counter the assimilation program. I mean, it's still there to some extent. I think some people's kind of dream for Sherman, it became just like an all Indian all the time school. That would be cool. But they still are operating under BIA rules. So there is that assimilative element. But all the things that these teachers are doing outside of it, indigenous foods, horticulture and agriculture and new programs, and especially with the support of tribes like San Manuel, who keep funding like our Native Pathways program that's is just funding more opportunities in different fields. I mean, that's what's making the difference, and that's what's keeping the school going, because not a lot is done federally at that level. It's just kind of remaining at a status quo, but it's all these outside people that are coming in, and a lot of the people, if they're not teachers, they come in as drummers for powwow nights. They come in as dancers. They help organize the powwow, things like that. And you know, it's such a tight community as well. You tend to get the same volunteers over and over again that just wouldn't think of not helping. So.
Yeah, I don't have a question, but I have more of a comment. As you know, I met you, Amanda and Sisquoc, when I visited last October as part of the tour that was going on with the ATALM conference, the Association on Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. And one of the things that I was impressed by was the sense of community, and really just have to say it touches me on a level that is hard to describe. The fact that you guys have taken on the preservation of this history without the support of the BIA, but that it's that important to you. And it really struck me when Sisquoc was sharing her family history, that these are not just records, these are not just objects and artifacts and data, these are our family histories and stories. So I just that's my comment, is just I'm really grateful that you all are sharing this with us so that we can be a part of it, because what I sensed when I was there was that spirit of community that has grown and developed, and it's beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's been it's just a long process, and I think a lot of the as far as for our school has been by individuals that have kind of just taken it upon themselves, that the importance of these programs, and just kind of initiated them and did them, and it's community coming together. But I know, like during the 60s and 70s, the civil rights movement, the Red Power movement, things changed here. Kids could start having their hair long, just different things. Then of course the Native American Religious Freedom Act. Then kids were no longer forced to go to churches. They could also practice their native ceremonies, but it wasn't anything in writing. It was just individuals stepping forward, knowing their rights, and pursuing that. Also, when in the 60s, like the Johnson O'Malley Act, just different things that have made it more that we'll be able to do these things. I know the 1980s, my mom and a committee of staff, they wanted to have a powwow here, and they had to fight pretty hard, you know, to get it cleared and approved. It took a while, and they did, and so that continues today. It was 1986, and she was one of the staff on that committee to start that powwow, our annual powwow, and it's still carried on today by different staff that step up to sponsor that powwow. The Native classes, even in the library, Native books, things like that, that started in the 60s when Senator Kennedy came and did a tour of the campus and noticed there wasn't any Native books in the library, and that changed pretty quick. Things like that. So it's been a slow process, and it has to be staff willing, or faculty willing to step up, or students requesting it, because those things could be just easily covered up, because we are here to education, to get them on to higher education or to an employment, or like that. but the cultural preservation and acknowledgement of our culture and awareness is so important, and it's finally the past 20 years, maybe not just here but in our communities, is being acknowledged. That's part of our healing, is bringing our culture, not bringing it back, but just making it part of our lives again, making it something positive. And here at the schools, our culture, traditions, songs, dances, stories, they're back home. They are back home. But those teachings and blessings, the protocols, the things that go along with that can carry over with the students here. So I try to encourage that, or we try to encourage that, those traditional ways of our people, our traditional values. And so, we're an intertribal school, so we can't just go all one tribal way. One thing we do is, part of my job is to let the students that come here know about our local tribes and know our traditions here. And they really, a lot of them are really surprised. They don't know about, you're coming to California, you think of Disneyland and the ocean and Knott's Berry Farm or things like that. And they don't know about our 32 tribes here that in Southern California, and that really support our students and welcome them. And so that's one of the things here, and that kind of plants the seeds for the students. Well, this is what we do here. This is the plants we use here. This is our bird songs, or our things like that. And so kind of share with us what you do. So it's been a lot of that, not just staff, but also the students sharing. The students share a lot with each other, and that has been going on for years, because I know my grandma would talk about her roommate was from Alaska, and she'd have the canned salmon, and she just loved that. She's Apache, and she never had that. So that's part of it too. So it's not just one way, and it just takes the staff, the students, to support that. Through some of our programming, like we have our culture center, which is named after Dr. Frank Clark, which is a graduate from 1939 here at Sherman. And the culture center was started as a behavioral health center in the 80s, because that was his philosophy. He brought that into his medical field of the mind, body, and spirit of our native way of healing, and he would bring that into his practice. And so when we opened that center, it was as a behavioral health center to help students to find other ways of healing from substance abuse. And then eventually we became a zero tolerance school, and so they kind of felt they didn't have a need for it, so it closed down for a while. And then we opened it back up in 2007 as a culture center, just the same thing, to promote that healing. And then a couple of years ago, we opened the language center. This was a place where the language was forbidden. We as all schools were, and so we need to have that language center here, a place available for students to come and have their study groups and work together. And that's still in it's in its baby stages. I'd like to see it really grow and flourish. So there's a lot, but it's not anything that's assigned to somebody. It takes somebody to want and see that need. And I my mother, myself, and a lot of other staff on campus, feel that way. And the importance of our culture and traditions and traditional values in healing, especially while the kids are away from their families and their tribal communities. But now with the internet and all of, it's easier to connect with their people too. So I hope that we can develop more programs with our culture and traditions and teaching through that.
Thank you for sharing those insights. Extremely helpful in understanding, especially what Amanda was discussing with decolonizing boarding school experiences. And so, yeah, very, very interesting to see the evolution of the institution and the focus on culture and language and traditions. Here's a question with a particularly strong relevance to our current contemporary moment. And I'm also curious, along with this person, how did Sherman Boarding School historically deal with the 1918 flu pandemic? If that's something that you came across in, the archives or your understanding, and especially, I'm sure that's something that many others are interested in as well.
Anyone?
We're all looking at you.
I think it was a much bigger deal on campus, the 1904 typhoid. And there was a lot of course, attention on tuberculosis at that time. So at that period, right before the 1918 pandemic, they had made changes to the hospital outdoor sleeping rooms, things like that, to try to mitigate some of that. So I can't think of anything that's specifically flu related, but that's because it was a little bit of hotbed contagion before then for multiple things. So I don't see anything specific about it.
Yeah, based on my recollection, it seems like the newsletter, the newsletters at that time were mostly focused on World War I. That was like the thing that they talked about all the time. I don't, if I saw anything about the Spanish flu, it might have just been a little blip.
Yeah,
I don't
they
recall
went into that.
being
Wasn't,
a big
of course,
focus
the
on that.
bulletins are so heavily censored too. They're not about to talk about all the kids that are sick at Sherman. They're going to talk about the war and how they can get more people into the war and draft them as soon as they get out of Sherman, et cetera, even though they're not citizens. But a lot of the stuff that you find on the medical is just through the records. When I first started and I asked Sisquoc, how come so many people died in 1904? And then you find out it's from typhoid, but that wasn't anything that would have been advertised.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. You might like to quote or bring up Jean Keller's work. Jean Keller did her dissertation on the health conditions of students from 1901 to 1921, and her book is called Empty Beds, and that might cover that. But in her research, exactly what Amanda's talking about, we couldn't find anything about the 1904 epidemic. The letterpress book wasn't available. There wasn't anything. The commissioner's superintendent's letter to the commissioner for his report in 1904 mentioned a few illnesses, nothing about all the deaths. And then Jean and I looked more, and then we found the financial records, the financial booklet, and in there it talked about how they bought tents, coffins, ice, and hired a few irregular nurses during that time. So we knew, what was going on. Eventually, Jean did find that information on the 11 students that died from the typhoid fever epidemic in 1904, 7 of which are buried at our school cemetery. So you might look into her book, and Jean Keller is the author of that, and she was our second dissertation done here at the school.
Yeah, we found that with other schools as well, that in general, during those earlier years, the first half of the century, that this was a policy, that the schools did try to keep those things quiet. It was definitely something that, they didn't want to be having on the record that students were dying at their schools. And also, with the historical context, around the time of the typhoid, tuberculosis, and Spanish flu pandemics, we still had not seen the Miriam report, right, which was the first report to kind of outline that there were subpar health and nutrition and even education standards being implemented at these schools. So,
yeah, records. There's attached to some of these records of children that died at the school or had typhoid. You'll see that maybe the family, that 4 siblings were sent home the same day, and the reason was given was because the parents were dissatisfied, because the parents came up after their child died, saw the conditions, and pulled their children out. But it's like very complicit in that it doesn't say they took their kids back home because their sister died. It just says the parents were dissatisfied. And so you see that a lot in those early records. It's obviously trying to almost hide the fact that was going on.
Yeah, there are a lot of examples of that, and letters too of parents saying, "Please send my other children home." Mm-hmm. I saw more than one letter that "Please send my other children home because their brother died." Or I think there was one where the father was saying, my daughter died. How am I going to bring her body home? That was really sad. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that there are more examples of that.
Well, at this point, we are at our time limit, and so we want to respect everyone's time here and thank everyone for joining us. As always, please reach out to us for any further questions, info@nabshc.org. We are extremely happy and humbled to be joined by this team and everyone that has had a hand in this webinar series. Recordings of all 3 parts of these series will be available forthcoming, and so be on the lookout for our announcements on our social media. Join our newsletter, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and check our website. We are, again, really thankful for you joining us over these past couple of weeks. If you're interested in becoming a member of the coalition, please visit our website, and you can fill out an application there and send it directly to us. Membership is free for individuals. And yeah, so thank you again very much to our amazing presenters. On behalf of NABS, we are really excited to be able to continue this work forward. So have a great rest of your day, the week, and we'll be speaking with all of you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.